I always believed a parent's job was to pave the way for their children, even if it meant running yourself ragged. I was no different. From the moment my son was born, I wanted him to have opportunities I never did. I worked extra shifts to put him in good schools, stayed up late, helping with homework, and spent what little savings I had sending him to college. I never suspected that one day he'd see me as nothing more than an obstacle. It's bizarre to think how close we once were. When he was little, he'd follow me around the house, mimicking my every move. I'd take him fishing on Saturdays, cherishing that proud grin whenever he reeled in a small catch. I thought I'd raised him to value respect and gratitude. So you can imagine my shock when he came to me with a plan to sell my home, my only home, and move me into a cramped condo while he upgraded to a bigger house with his fiancée. He made it sound like a marvelous arrangement. I'd get a cozy little space, and he'd take the bulk of the money from my bungalow's sale to invest in his dream property. He treated my home as if it were just a piece of real estate, not the place where I'd laughed, cried, and said goodbye to my wife when she passed. The moment he suggested it, I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just a misguided idea, it felt like a betrayal. My son, my flesh and blood, was looking at me as a stepping stone for his big purchase. And the worst part? He assumed I'd be grateful for it, like he was doing me a favor. That's when I realized everything was about to change. I remember standing in the kitchen, staring at the worn linoleum floor and thinking about how many times I'd scrubbed it clean after my son spilled juice as a child. This wasn't just real estate, it was my history. I tried to reason with him, explaining that I wasn't ready to move and that I treasured my home. He waved off my concerns. He insisted he knew what was best for me, that I'd be more comfortable in a new place, that the bungalow was too old and too small to accommodate his growing family. To him, it was a foregone conclusion. I'd sell, we'd combine our resources, and I'd quietly occupy a back room in his new suburban fortress. Every time I tried to protest, he'd interrupt with some condescending remark about my or my lack of modern thinking. It was infuriating. I was healthy, capable of making my own choices, yet he treated me like an invalid. Then he crossed the line. He told me if I didn't agree voluntarily, he'd find a way to have me declared unfit to live alone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own son was threatening me with legal action, implying he'd do whatever it took to get his hands on my property. The realization gutted me. I felt my heart rate spike, my cheeks burn with fury, but I forced myself to remain calm. I asked him to give me a little time to think it over. He smirked, like he was certain I'd come around. Inside, I was planning my retaliation. If he wanted a fight, I'd give him one. I wasn't some feeble old man he could bully. I was the father who'd sacrificed everything, and I was about to show him what that meant. That night, I could barely sleep. Memories of him as a sweet toddler played in my mind, jarring against the hard reality of the man he'd become. I realized I needed professional help to protect my assets. Early the next morning, I called a lawyer recommended by a friend. He specialized in estate law. After I laid out the situation, he advised me to consider transferring ownership of my home into a trust. That way, if my son tried any legal maneuver to declare me incompetent, he still wouldn't be able to touch the property. I left his office with a stack of paperwork, feeling both anxious and oddly exhilarated. Over the next few days, I acted like nothing was amiss whenever my son dropped by. He'd ask if I was coming around to his plan, and I'd offer a non-committal shrug. Deep down, I was outraged that he felt so entitled, but I knew I couldn't tip my hand. Let him think I was weakening, that I'd eventually cave. Meanwhile, I made sure to document every conversation. I recorded his phone calls and saved his text messages. I wanted undeniable proof of his intentions if he tried to paint me as the villain. It felt underhanded, but after all he'd threatened, I wasn't about to rely on goodwill. Then came the day he arrived unannounced with a real estate agent. He wanted to get the house appraised, just to see what it was worth. I hid my fury, nodding politely as the agent measured the rooms, took notes, and commented on possible renovations. My son followed her around, bragging that he'd modernized the space. The disrespect was maddening, but I kept quiet, reminding myself that soon enough he'd discover just how wrong he was to underestimate me. Very soon, I bided my time, working closely with my lawyer to finalize the trust. The paperwork was extensive, but it left no loopholes for my son to exploit. He kept texting me, urging me to move forward before the housing market changed. Each message felt like a slap, a reminder that he saw me as a meal ticket. I responded sparingly, pretending to be on the fence. Whenever he visited, he acted impatient, pacing around, eyeing the walls like they were dollar signs. It struck me how little he cared about the sentimental value of this place. He'd grown cold, calculating. The boy who used to light up when I came home from work was gone, replaced by a man hungry for an upgrade. One evening, he showed up demanding I sign a power of attorney form so he could handle the sale. That's when I realized he truly believed I was feeble enough to let him take control. I feigned confusion, flipping through the pages while he hovered over my shoulder. Inside, I was burning. How dare he think he could just brush me aside? But I hid my anger behind a trembling hand and told him I needed more time to read it carefully. He left in a huff, warning me not to drag my feet. As soon as he was gone, I called my lawyer and moved up our timeline. I wanted to finalize the trust immediately, ensuring that my home could never be sold without my explicit approval. The next day, I signed the last of the documents and felt a wave of relief. My bungalow, with all its memories, was now safely beyond his reach. Whatever he tried next, I was ready. The betrayal still stung, but the thought of revenge kept me focused. Very focused. Within a week, my son returned, this time with his fiancée by his side. She was visibly pregnant, her expression a mixture of annoyance and impatience. They claimed to be worried about my safety, hinting that the bungalow was too old and that I was too stubborn to see reality. I knew their real motive was the looming deadline on the bigger house they intended to buy. They were desperate, and desperation made them bolder. His fiancée started talking about baby-proofing, pointing at the electrical outlets and windows as if she were staging a performance. Then, with a sweet but insincere smile, she mentioned how beneficial it would be for me to live under their care. I nearly laughed out loud. The hypocrisy was astounding. My son, emboldened by her presence, demanded I sign preliminary sale documents he'd brought along. That's when I looked him in the eye and told him I'd already made arrangements to ensure the house couldn't be sold without my approval. His face drained of color. She sputtered, asking what that meant for their plan. I shrugged, offering no apology. The room went silent for a moment. Then he exploded, accusing me of betrayal. I reminded him that he was the one who first threatened legal action. He stormed off, mumbling that I'd regret this. His fiancée shot me a glare before following him out. I felt a strange calm settle over me. No more lies, no more pretending. My property was safe, and I had no intention of bending to their will. The next time I heard from him, I knew it wouldn't be a polite request. But I was prepared. I had spent my whole life caving in to his needs. This time, I was ready to fight back. I refused to yield again. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, my doorbell rang at dawn. My son stood there, barely meeting my gaze, and told me he'd put down a hefty deposit on a new house. He explained that if he couldn't produce the full down payment soon, he'd lose everything he'd invested. He tried to guilt me with a trembling voice, reminding me that his fiancée was pregnant and deserved a proper home. I let him speak, noticing how his eyes darted around, as if searching for sympathy in the familiar corners of the bungalow. When he finished, I calmly told him I wasn't selling. He said I'd regret turning him away. I replied that I already regretted raising someone who saw me as a bank instead of a father. That must have stung because he launched into a tirade, blaming me for jeopardizing his future, for refusing to adapt, for not caring about my future grandchild. I stood there, arms folded, unwavering. His words felt like knives, but I refused to show any wound. Eventually, he switched tactics and tried to sweet-talk me, saying we could all live together in the new place. I saw right through it. I told him to leave. He stormed out, muttering that I'd ruined his life. Once he was gone, I sank into my old armchair, a swirl of anger and sorrow churning in my chest. I thought of my late wife, how proud she'd been of our son. If only she could see the man he'd become. The hurt was real, but so was my resolve. The more he pushed, the more determined I became. I wasn't the one who started this fight, but I was damn sure going to finish it. My lawyer advised me to brace for more drastic measures. I received letters from another attorney threatening to challenge my mental capacity. Each threat felt like a bitter pill. Still, I stayed calm. We drafted formal responses, attaching the records of my son's hostile messages. I even had an audio recording of him saying he'd do whatever it takes to gain control of my home. My lawyer was confident no judge would side with such an obvious power grab. Meanwhile, my son kept pushing. He and his fiancée showed up one afternoon trying a different angle. Sob stories about how the bank wouldn't approve their mortgage without a larger down payment, how they'd be homeless if I didn't cooperate. I didn't flinch. I told them they should have thought about that before they tried to evict me from my own house. His fiancée burst into tears, calling me selfish, accusing me of not caring about my grandchild's future. I reminded her that I was the one who had cared for my son all these years, and if he truly cared for me, he wouldn't be trying to rip my home away. That's when she snapped, yelling that I was an ungrateful old man who didn't know what was best for anyone. My son tried to calm her, but she'd already said enough. I pointed to the door and told them both to get out. They left in a flurry of curses and slammed doors. I won't deny it hurt, but each insult only hardened my resolve. I was done being their stepping stone. If they needed money, they would have to earn it or find it elsewhere. I had sacrificed enough of my life for my son's dreams, and I refused to sacrifice my home too. Days passed, and the updates I heard through mutual friends were grim for them. The seller of their dream house was growing impatient. The deadline for the closing date loomed, and they were short on funds. My son tried once more, calling late at night to apologize. He said he'd been under pressure and hadn't meant all those terrible things. He begged me to at least co-sign the loan, promising I could keep my bungalow. That was the moment I realized how transactional our relationship had become. He didn't care about me, he cared about what I could offer. I told him no. He threatened that I'd never see his child. I told him that was his choice to make, not mine. I reminded him of every time I'd helped him in the past, from covering his college expenses to bailing him out of credit card debt, and how this was how he repaid me. He had no answer for that. Instead, he hung up in a rage. Later, I learned he tried to borrow money from other relatives, but none wanted to be entangled in his shady tactics. The clock ticked away. I continued living my life quietly, refusing to engage with his desperate pleas. I had done all I could to guide him, and he'd thrown it back in my face. If he lost that house, if his fiancée left him, if he ended up in debt, that was on him. People can call me heartless, but after what he tried to do, I felt no guilt. I kept my door locked and my heart closed. He had crossed a line that I could never forgive, and I saw no point in pretending otherwise. The final blow came a week later. My son showed up alone, eyes red, face sullen. He looked at me, then at the living room walls lined with old family photos. He confessed that the deal was about to fall through, that they were going to lose their deposit, and that his fiancée was furious. He said if I didn't help, it would destroy his relationship and his future. In a trembling voice, he asked me, "Do you really want me to fail like this?" I felt a surge of conflicting emotions, but my anger prevailed. This wasn't me condemning him to fail. It was him refusing to accept the consequences of his own betrayal. I shook my head and told him, "You did this to yourself." He started sobbing, actually dropping to his knees, pleading for me to reconsider. There was a time when seeing my son cry would have broken me, but that time was gone. I told him to get up, that I wasn't moved by crocodile tears. If he had learned anything, it should be that trying to bully or con me out of my home was never going to work. He cursed under his breath, called me a selfish old man, and stumbled out the door. I stood there, breathing heavily, closing my eyes as I heard his car roar away. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of liberation, like I was finally free of the one-sided devotion that had dictated my life for decades. I had protected my home, and more importantly, I had protected my dignity. If my son hated me for it, so be it. Some betrayals are simply beyond forgiveness. 3 days later, I received a short text from him. "We lost the house. Hope you're happy." I stared at the screen, a wave of relief and sadness washing over me. Happy? No, not exactly. But I was satisfied that I still had my bungalow, my independence, and my pride. Soon after, I heard that his fiancée had broken off the engagement, blaming him for not delivering on his promises. He ended up scrambling for a place to stay, leaning on distant friends. People might judge me for not stepping in. Maybe they think I should have shown compassion. But compassion doesn't mean allowing yourself to be exploited by your own child. I wasn't the villain he tried to paint me as. I was a father who refused to be used again. In a last-ditch effort, he called and asked if we could talk things out, maybe start over. I said no. I told him I wouldn't reward his betrayal with a clean slate. Actions have consequences, and his had caught up to him. If he ever wanted a real relationship, he'd have to rebuild trust on my terms, not by waltzing in with sob stories and empty apologies. He called me cruel, said he'd never speak to me again. I let him vent, feeling only numbness. When he finally hung up, I put the phone down, turned on the TV, and let myself sink into the quiet. I wasn't going to chase him, beg him, or try to fix his mess. He'd chosen his path. 3 weeks after that, I learned he was living in a cramped apartment, his credit in shambles, and his former fiancée nowhere in the picture. People gossiped, saying it was a shame we'd fallen out, that family should stick together. I've never felt the need to defend myself. My conscience was clear. He tried to steal my home, threatened to declare me incompetent, and expected me to finance his luxurious new life. He turned my love and trust into weapons against me. So I turned the tables and defended what was mine. If anyone wanted to call that cruel or vindictive, I didn't care. They hadn't lived through the heartache of watching a beloved child morph into a callous opportunist. In the evenings, I'd sit in my living room, the same room where we once played board games, and reflect on how things might have been different if he'd remembered the meaning of gratitude. But regret changes nothing. I kept my house, my memories, and my self-respect. He lost everything because he valued a bigger mortgage more than the father who raised him. Sometimes you don't choose revenge. Revenge chooses you when someone crosses lines they never should have crossed. That's exactly what happened here, and I have no remorse. My son wanted to kick me out of my own home. He learned the hard way that not every parent is willing to be a doormat. If that means we never speak again, so be it. My door remains closed, figuratively and literally. I lost a son, but I kept my life intact. After all those years of sacrificing for him, I learned I have to protect myself too, and I did. I won.